Alright, good evening. I'm Connor. Tonight I will be refuting my opponent's claim that legalizing narcotics will reduce government spending and increase government revenue. To start off, the idea that decriminalizing drugs will decrease government spending is not a claim of fact. It is a fact. It's not disputable, there's no controversy. If you take a substance, a new good, and you tax it, you will create revenue. If you decrease government spending by cutting police officers, you will decrease your spending. My opponent starts off by mentioning two secondary claims, the first being that legalizing narcotics will reduce government spending on law enforcement. He mentions Portugal and Portugal's society, how they have decriminalized drugs as an example. Yet he fails to cite and provide any evidence upon that. Also, Portugal is just one example. For instance, Mexico decriminalized drugs in 2009, of which Jorge Hernandez stated in his series on legislative reform of drug policy that decriminalization of drugs gives encouragement to crime, which would in turn mean more law enforcement and more government spending. He then stated that we could cut the amount of money spent on prisoners by half. This half amount is apparently arbitrary because we are given no significant evidence to why we could reduce it to half. He then offers a solution to reapportion the money into prevention programs and rehabilitation, which doesn't save money, it simply moves it from one place to another, government still spending. He even stated in his speech that money saved on prisons is a wash with the money spent for rehabilitation. This is also a claim of policy, as he goes on to mention that spending money in rehabilitation and in prevention is better for the health of our society. It does not support his claim that reducing government spending on law enforcement. In regards to his secondary claim, his second secondary claim, which is in essence the first secondary claim and his major claim, it is not a controversial issue that narcotics could be sold legally and taxed, creating revenue for the government. If you take a new good, bring it into a population and tax it, you will create revenue. There is no controversy. According to Edmund Hartnett, a former police chief of New York City, he stated that we need to ask legalization proponents if the alleged profits from drug legalization would be enough to pay for the increased fatal defects, loss of workplace productivity, increased traffic fatalities, industrial accidents, increased domestic violence, and the myriad of other problems that would not only be high-cost items, but extremely expensive in terms of social decay. My opponent chooses specifically government spending, which is not a controversial claim in terms of fact. There is no controversy, no one will argue against it. The controversy in this claim lies in policy and value. The choice to decriminalize drugs is either something we should do or should not do, and it is based upon value. In conclusion, my opponent's claim is not controversial, and his evidence fails to be sufficient and adequate to support his claim. Thank you.
All right, Connor, you basically have this argument that says that there's not really any dispute here, so we don't really have an argument, because if you legalize something, tax revenues and the decreased cost of enforcement are automatically going to result in some kind of savings or financial windfall for us. You know, and I think that you take that as a presupposition, and I'm not exactly sure that's the case. And in fact, later on, you kind of contradict this very position that you're taking at the beginning, which says there's no argument because this is going to happen, by pointing out that there are a whole bunch of places that have legalize this like Portugal and Mexico, and apparently in Mexico, where they decriminalized it, they're experiencing some problems. And then you cite down at the end of your argument the former New York City police chief, who suggests that we would have consequent costs that we would have to pay for in order to legalize these substances. So there is a trade-off. The question is the trade-off advantageous or disadvantageous? I guess that's where the factual dispute is. You kind of try and reduce it to an issue of value or an issue of policy, but there are issues of fact on this, and this is one, and you're trying to have it both ways on that, and I think that's a little bit problematic. I like the idea that you have here that suggests that, look, we're not going to really save money because of spending, because we're going to have to spend a whole bunch of money on rehab. And so the idea of prisons, and even the advocate says that it's going to be a wash, because whatever costs we would save in spending there, we would have to spend on those kinds of rehabilitation programs. And you cite the advocate's own position on this point. So I think that diminishes that particular claim. Then it's the second claim that really needs to be developed a little bit more. You mentioned, in that whole inventory of things, all of the potential costs that are there, productivity, accidents, social problems, which, by the way, all of those sorts of things are going to have costs that are borne by government. There are medical costs that are borne by government, legal costs that are borne by government. The productivity issues might become an issue if the government has to intervene by providing unemployment insurance, or if there is a loss in productivity because tax revenues go down because incomes are affected in some way. I think that's where this argument could really be developed a little bit more, and that's where your dispute is. So you kind of deny that there's any dispute, then you present the dispute, and that's the thing that I think needed to be developed a little bit more on that particular point. All right, thank you.